This video is sponsored by HelloFresh. I don't like oil paint. I don't get it. I have purchased like every single product. I have tried every technique, every style. I cannot get oil paint to work. I just don't like doing it. I don't like mixing and being careful with these expensive, stinky paints. And I see online beautiful videos of people making the most amazing things happen almost instantaneously, but I just can't figure it out. But there is a new product, Newsh. Maybe there's something to this. I never want to use oil paint ever again, and I am pinning all my hopes and dreams that this is going to be the solution, because I still want to try out that style of painting, but I don't want to mess around with oils anymore. And I think a ton of people are in the same boat, because when this stuff first got released, it sold out so fast, and it's taken so long for me to actually be able to buy a bottle. I really hope this works. I have tried for years to like oil paints, and the best I can do is call them interesting. I painted my Basilion fleet for Mantic's game Armada using only oil paints, and it worked, but my sails are ruddier than I would have liked, and the yellow paint mixed with the browns more than I would have hoped. And I painted up my Malifaux Nekima crew using oil paint. I spent about a month on these models, carefully painting them with oil paint, and then I only managed to get them good after I gave up on oils and went back to my acrylics to finish them up. Only the base coats are truly oil paint. And on terrain, the thing that oil paint should be best at, it was only a partial success. It rubbed off a lot of the paint because I used the wrong primer, and the finished minis ended up too dark for my liking. I couldn't wipe off as much paint as I thought I would be able to. It feels like with oils, you're giving up a lot of control for the benefit of easier blending and the longer working time, and I don't know how much control I'm willing to give up. To test out Newsh, I have the Spearhead terrain for Age of Sigmar, and I have been loving the game, and it has lots of lovely texture that should be just the thing for oil paint. To get it ready, I used ultra thin superglue to put it together. Ultra thin superglue has a really shallow surface tension, so it penetrates deep into the cracks and makes for a really strong bond. And I sanded the bottoms flat with 60 grit and then 150 grit sandpaper so the pieces sit flat with no wobble. I gave all the mold lines a sanding, and I fixed any gaps with Tamiya putty. Seams and mold lines will be highlighted by the oil wash style of painting, so it's important to make sure the models are as clean as possible before painting. Then I gave all the parts a black prime with acrylic primer. I've gotten myself into trouble before using oil-based rattle can primer and having it reactivate with oil paint. That shouldn't be a problem because Newsh is acrylic, but I'm not taking any chances. I zenithal the parts with some light gray paint, light gray instead of white, so hopefully the finished product will be a little darker than my minis. I want my minis to stand out in comparison to the terrain. I've got a nice neutral base down on this terrain, and now to see what this Newsh is made of. Time for a sniff test. It's kind of just smells like paint. I don't know, we'll see. I put a little tan and a little light green down on my palette and added a drop of Newsh to each color, mixing them together thoroughly. Then I cut up some makeup sponges into small pieces. I rubbed these colors onto the wall and then rubbed them off, and it seems like the paint is very fragile, which is what I'm looking for. I tried again with a mixture of brown paint, and this darker color seemed to stick around a lot better than the light colors. After this little experiment, I think I have a better idea of what I'm doing, and I decided to do some more base coating. I put gold paint over the trim of the walls and some dark brass over the Skaven skulls, chains, and warpstone machines. The Newsh did a decent job of staining, but really regular acrylic paint can stain just fine too. The real test is going to be to see if it can shade like oil paints can shade. And it has a nice working time. It dries pretty darn quick. It's probably dry at about 10 minutes, but I prefer that. Oil paint, you can be risky at like 4 or 5 hours, but really you should let it set overnight, where this stuff I can just keep right on rolling. It's pretty quick, almost as quick as today's sponsor, HelloFresh. Has this ever been you? You're sitting there painting away on a brand new mini, you're in the zone, base coating, highlighting, shading, when boom, your stomach growls, and you have no idea what to do for dinner. Well, have no fear, HelloFresh is here to help. HelloFresh is a meal kit provider that sends you pre-proportioned ingredients, recipes right to your door. Choose from over 50 different weekly recipes that cater directly to your palate. I personally received the white cheddar crunch burger, I mean, what's not to like, and it cooked up super fast, especially on Nick's grill. It was super easy and quick to pick out my meals for the week and have it delivered ready to cook with the recipe included, no thinking required. Even if you're trying to cater a meal around a picky eater, Sean, then HelloFresh still has you covered with easy protein and veggie swaps thanks to their modular main dish, sides, toppings, and more chosen right from ordering. So head on over to HelloFresh, link down below, and start planning out your easy meals today. I mixed some red brown in a cup with black paint and a lot of Newsh, and then I got a big ratty brush and gave the walls one complete coat of the mixture. Then I immediately attacked the walls with a wet paper towel. This did a great job of pulling off 80% of the paint, and then I went in with a makeup sponge and did some fine tuning, strategically pulling off more paint to get the middle of each wall section cleaner than the pillars in the bottom. I took special care on my Skelly, painting him separately from the walls to make sure he came out perfect. Comparing this wall to the unpainted one, there is a big difference between the two of them. The Newsh did a good job of washing the whole piece and sticking around with a nice gradient around the pillars and trim. I did the other wall sections, and the working time with Newsh meant that I had to work a little quickly, finishing one face of the wall at a time and then the top of the wall, so that the paint was still nice and wet while I was wiping it away. With oil paint, if you start wiping too early, it all comes off, and if you wait too long, it's already dried permanently and never comes off. With this Newsh stuff, it's simpler. Brush it on, wipe it off, and it works. On the smashed statue piece, I put gold paint into my airbrush and sprayed this over the statue bits. This is really rough painting, taking a little care to get the gold paint in the right spots, but it basically spilled all over. I gave the mini a once over with the Newsh and then wiped it away with a damp paper towel, and it worked well. In just 2 steps, the Newsh did a ton of work for me, washing, outlining, and setting down a gradient between the dirty recesses in the ground, and the clean bright bits of the statue. Now to try to get a little fancier, I mixed some light blue paint with plenty of Newsh and I put this over the dark brass parts. Gently rubbing these away with my makeup sponges, I was a little more aggressive with the sponge taking off the paint and it worked really well, sticking in the recesses and being bright and saturated. I've done this sort of painting before with just watered down acrylic paint and it looks very different wet versus dry, but here the paint looks about the same. I tried putting this Liqerise mixture on the gold, but it didn't look right. The gold and light blue are too similar in tone, so it didn't show up much. On the skeleton, I made a dark red Newsh mix and I brushed this into my fella, wiping it away, which added a nice element of grossness to this guy. I'm getting more used to the Newsh. It seems like it has to be mixed 2 to 1, 2 drops of Newsh for every drop of paint, for it to do the Newsh thing. I mixed up 3 colors, a dark green, a light green, and a white, and I tried putting this over the warp fire on the terrain. This was definitely the easiest wet blending I've ever done, but it didn't feel as good as oil paint. Oil paint is stable even when it's very thin layers of paint, where Newsh is very thick and gooey. It got the job done though. After 10 minutes, all my Newsh was dry, and I started paint on top of it. I dry brushed gold over all the brass parts and silver over the gold parts and a light gray over the stone parts. This worked really well. It's kind of classic painting. Even a lot of painting companies suggest to work in triads because it does usually take 3 colors to get an interesting look. This Newsh is just making those colors easier to get onto the mini. The airbrush easily laid down the base, the Newsh quickly added a shade, and the dry brushing is making a highlight, and each step was easy and is coming together to make the walls look like I tried way harder than I really did. On the warp stone, I airbrushed some neon green over them and then gave them a dry brushing of a mid-tone green and then a dark green, and then I did some sponging of white paint over the stone to add a little bit more texture. Now for the Skaven symbol. I airbrushed over it with white and then I made up some neon green and mid-tone green Newsh. I put these colors into the recesses of the symbol and then blended them together to get a little variation. This worked well in the recesses but missed a lot of the white overspray on the brick, so I put a thin layer of green Newsh over the walls to tint these sections. This all worked pretty well, even over the thin, fragile airbrush layers of paint. I was worried that the water in the Newsh would reactivate the paint, but I didn't really have any problems with the paint layers rubbing off. This spearhead terrain painted up in about 5 hours, and the reason it took so long was because I was really fussing and trying to learn my way around this stuff. I think I could get my second set of spearhead terrain finished. I bet I could get it done in like an hour to an hour and a half. Also, I mentioned second set of spearhead terrain. I have really been enjoying spearhead, and so yes, I got a second set of the spearhead terrain. But this stuff is interesting. It is not a perfect one-to-one for oil paint, but it is close enough that it actually has some of the flaws of oil paint. You do have to keep an eye out for really deep spots on the model where this stuff can pool, because the big pools of it take a lot longer to dry, and when you come back in with things like dry brushing, you can pick up that still wet paint and mush it around the model. It's not nearly as bad as with oil paints where those big blobs, like if you got a blob of oil paint, it could stay wet for weeks. Where this stuff, I mean, it's pretty much dry now that I've finished painting these guys up. And really the solution is pretty simple. You either wait longer before you put on more layers of paint, or you're just careful. Neither one of those things I'm particularly good at, but I am excited about the prospects of moving forward with Newsh. This stuff does give me a lot of the benefits of oil paint without the major drawbacks, which number 1 for me, I can never get oil paint to actually work, but number 2, the giant setup cost. I can put this stuff onto my wet palette every single day and it'll never be an issue. I can use all of my normal brushes, but with oil paint, I have to go find my mineral spirit. I have to get out my painting brushes that are only for oil paints. I have to use my oil paints. They're smelly and they have a lot of fumes. I think this stuff is gonna be really nice. And speaking of pretty good, I want to run one more little experiment with my Newsh because this terrain was really a get her done and get it looking good type of project, but I want to see if this stuff can hold up when I'm trying to paint really, really well. This is the Castellan character for my Black Templar, and one thing I am not excited to paint are his big skull shoulder pads. I love them, but they'll be tricky to paint because doing them manually will require hours of careful blending, and contrast and speed paint will give them harsh recesses and leave the raised areas mostly untouched, which I also don't want. I base coated the shoulder pads with some tan paint, which is the brightest layer of paint I want. Then I mixed up an ochre color of Newsh and coated the shoulders, quickly rubbing it off with a makeup sponge. On the first shoulder, I got the ratio slightly wrong, so I didn't get off as much paint as I wanted, but I nailed it on the second one using a little bit of paper towel to pull off the pools of paint that were stuck in his eye sockets. Now for the third layer, which will be the darkest color, brown paint. I once again put this over the entire shoulder pad and rubbed it away, making sure that there was some tan and ochre color showing through. This gave me lovely color gradients and gave me contrast without making any of the recesses too harsh, and it all happened in just a few minutes. For the trim, I base coated it with gold, and I want to try shading this with Newsh as well. Because I'm painting on top of metallic gold, I don't want to use regular opaque paints because they'll dull the shine of the gold, so instead I reached for a transparent ink. This worked for getting me the look I wanted, but it's very watery and made the Newsh into more of a wash. It flowed nicely in between the little skull rivets of the trim, and I could do some corrections with the makeup sponges. The Newsh got me 95% of the way there in record time, and I put some silver edge highlights on the trim, and I did some highlights of white on the skulls, face, cheekbones, and teeth to make them just a little bit brighter. And you know what else can make your skull a little brighter? That's right, our website. EonsOfBattle.com is the place to find our merch, like our new Nick and Jay dice, and the best way to support us doing what we do with a membership. Each month, members will get a credit they can use on our new monthly terrain packs or any previous pack we have ever made. This month, our new terrain is the Clone Expansion, a part 2 to our spaceship interior with new wall sections for building out the grisly facilities of a cloning laboratory, complete with examination/autopsy tables, cloning bays, and new doors. And the cloning doesn't stop there. The cloning towers are macabre monoliths drooping with pods full of fresh recruits or test subjects, depending on the needs of the mad scientists who operate them. I really like what the Newsh did. The skull looks really smooth, and to get the white highlights as smooth as the Newsh base coats, I mixed in one of my favorite products, Josonja Magic Mix, which helps paint get thinner without getting watery, and this lets me lay down some highlights that match the smoothness of the base coats. That worked. These shoulder pads are the type of detail where it would have been pretty tricky to do that all manually, and it did a really good job really quickly, which is really important to me because as much as I like the painting process, a big part of my enjoyment is having an ever-growing collection of really cool miniatures and really cool terrain, so anything that helps me get there quicker is really nice. Although, one thing that the Newsh doesn't do seemingly is blending very well, or at least not in the way that oil paints blend really well. In theory, since you've got your oil paint and that really high pigment mixture is gonna stay wet for a very long time, you can get these perfect blends and transitions. I've never been able to do it, but I've heard you can do it. But this stuff, when you mix it with paint, you have to mix it at least 2 to 1. 2 drops of Newsh for every 1 drop of paint for that mixture to be able to do the thing. And that makes a pretty flowy, gooey mass of paint. And so when you have one color and you want to lay down another color and then blend them in the middle, it doesn't really work. Now, I don't need this stuff to be able to do that because I have Josonja Magic Mix for that. Josonja makes the paint dry just a little bit slower, and that is really nice for acrylic paints. Like, acrylic paint dries in a few seconds. This gives you a few more seconds, and I feel like that's all I need to get nice blends with acrylic paint, as opposed to the oil paint, which you get something that looks kind of decent, but then you have to wait all night for that layer to dry, and then you come back to it the next day with oil paint, and then it ends up just reactivating and smearing the whole thing that you worked so hard on. But I'm really excited for Newsh. I think this stuff is pretty darn good, and what this stuff is really good at is you mix up a nice batch of some, like a darker color than your base coat color, and then you just slap that on, and then you very carefully wipe it away. And speaking of wiping, this stuff works really well with makeup sponges. And like, what I mean by that is I painted a bunch of terrain with oil paints a few months back, and I went through like a half of a big bag of makeup sponges. But since this stuff dries so fast, like this has got green on it, but I don't have to be worried when I use this little piece of foam that I'm gonna get green in my project because this is dry green paint. And even the little bits that I had completely saturated with paint, it doesn't really bleed in very much. So I can just cut this piece to get to the fresh foam, and I can just keep right on going. This whole day I've been working with this stuff, I used two makeup sponges, where if I was using regular oil paint, I would have gone through many makeup sponges because it soaks up into the sponge and it never ever dries. So you just have to constantly be reaching for fresh ones. Or with this stuff, you just let it dry on the sponge. It's kind of a new sponge again. Not bad. I was definitely worried that Newsh would be a gimmick, and it kind of is. It's a special effect. It makes a slow-drying, fragile paint layer, but it does that consistently and effectively and quickly. And I think those combinations of elements means that it is gonna be something very useful in my painting library. Let me know in the comments below, has anybody tried Newsh? I haven't heard much about this product, but I can definitely say after a day of playing with it, I like it. I'm gonna be adding it to my painting library, and I would love some more ideas or techniques that you can do with this goo. I love a good goo. Thanks for watching.